Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, country music out through Invisible Publishing, Zane Koss's new book of poetry. He joins me on the program to talk about it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you. I want to start with the epigraph because you have William Wordsworth, but then you have a quote from what you say traditional East Kootenays that reappears in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about the decision that goes into like what starts a book like this off and pulling from the book itself rather than hinting at the book as a lot of other epigraphs do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely right to point out the sort of discrepancy there between typically the epigraph doesn't come from the book itself, but I had read that Wordsworth epigraph in an essay by a friend. In fact, I don't think I've ever actually read the full poem that it's from. And it, and that little epigraph sort of speaks to that sort of jovial storytelling, sort of social context that I'm interested in with this book. And I'm sort of a fan, and this happens sort of throughout the book. This is maybe kind of a microcosmic moment of it, that sort of push and pull between kind of deflationary moments, whether that's sort of telling a story and then immediately kind of like raising sort of critical questions about, a story that I know generates a laugh because I laughed when I heard that story, but then immediately sort of pulling out the rug from the reader by sort of starting to examine more critically, what are we laughing at here? But I think that sort of just that juxtaposition between those two quotes, I think speaks to that type of rhetorical move that I guess happens throughout the book, but then also too, it's a quote that I'm supposing we probably can't read out on the air. And
Right.
It's because of that juxtaposition between 19th century romantic British poetry and the sort of expletive-laden comment that was passed around at one of my dad's job sites that he was working on during the pandemic, and sort of passed that moment on to me.
So as I said, yes, some words we can't say on air, but it does speak to like the wordiness of like classic poetry, and then whether you're kind of pushing up against like what we consider poetry, and that's something that I noted, because you at one point write, my mom tells me poems over the phone sometimes when she calls, and they say things like he's dying of cancer, so I'm sure someone told him by now, like that. What we consider poetry is maybe something that you're challenging.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think, thanks for pointing to that moment, because that was a phone call I had with my mom, and just and it's reproduced sort of exactly in that poem as she said it over the phone to me. And it was just one of those moments of like, this is a linguistic event that is like on par with any poem I've ever read. Just this like perfectly encapsulated little nugget of meaning and language, and sort of what it means to be alive and in relationships with other people, even if those relationships are ones of work and labor and care. So yeah, and then it was just sort of that thinking that like, this thing that my mom said over the phone to me could have been a William Carlos Williams poem.
Is it like, because you've studied poetry, obviously, like you've
Yes.
it's not just a poet, but like someone who's like an academic around this topic, and you come from as you point out place that's not necessarily like conducive to it, or that like it's not nascent there. I'm curious, is this like a internal conversation with yourself that like there is like kind of like, I want to find the reason why poetry speaks to me, despite growing up in a place where poetry purportedly doesn't exist, and so I'm identifying this as poetry, or like, is it something different?
Mm. I do think it's funny, because in the last year or so, as I've been sort of, working on this project and thinking about this project by, excuse me, performing it, that I do keep stumbling across little instances. And this started sort of with my entry into scholarship. I was doing my master's degree at McGill in 2012 through 2014, and in an anthology of Canadian poetry that I was assigned, there was a poem that referenced a cemetery on the other side of the lake that I grew up on, and it was this sort of like moment of like, whoa, people can write poetry about where I'm from. And then, of course, since then, people like Dale or David Zeroth and Fred Waugh, most famously, has written poems about like the valley where I grew up, and there's other sort of that generation of 70s prairie poets as I've kind of learned more about them. Some of them, like many people in that period and in our continuing moment, people have moved off the prairies and into the mountains, and there are poems, more poems, and I keep finding them about the area where I grew up, and they always sort of seem like these fantastic little artifacts that an alternate history version of me having discovered these things maybe as a teenager, I might have taken a different path forward. But I do I think like one of the kind of originating moments of thinking that poetry is something that might speak to me, and I mentioned once already William Carlos Williams, but just reading some of his poems when I was, in grade 8 or 9, and just seeing that poetry could be that simple, that poetry could still speak to me in a meaningful way, but in a language that I could understand, was a really sort of important first sort of step onto this path towards thinking about poetry and writing poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about kind of like, because throughout this book, there's a lot about storytelling, right? Like, tell me that story. Oh, that's not how you tell this story. Those kinds of motifs recur. And I was curious about, like, if you're trying to identify that people are already poets within these communities or within these spaces, and that what we conceive of as poetry maybe creates a false narrative that that's not something that happens in these places.
Well, and I think too, I'm cautious about, in the same way that 10 years ago, there was sort of a weird little bit of a momentary sort of trend in academia to think about rap music and hip hop within sort of the broader continuum of poetry. And while I do think, I love rap music, I love hip hop, huge fan. But I always think that trying to subsume rap into poetry misses so much of the vital context that moves that music. And indeed, that music is music. It's not just poetry on the page. And I think that there's a way of thinking about these linguistic practices in dialogue, but I don't think either is ever fully collapsible into the other. And so, in the same way, when I think about storytelling, the oral storytelling traditions that I'm sort of drawing on for this book, that was sort of one of the main barriers. Was I knew even when I was a teenager and I started sort of shaping myself into a writer, I knew that I wanted to do something with these stories, but I also knew that anytime I just wrote these stories down on the page, they were very boring and they didn't quite have the same dramatic punch and flair as they did, when told around a campfire late at night. And so, and that was, now 20 years ago. I've been sort of thinking about that problem and running up against that problem for 20 years now, in a way. And so this book, kind of the originating moment in which allowed me to begin writing this book as a book, was rather than sort of butting up against that problem and then running away from it, or butting up against that problem and throwing my hands up and saying, well, there's nothing I can do, was then to sort of use my critical scholarly training as a means of sort of interrogating what exactly that barrier is. And so in writing this book, it's sort of a reckoning with the gap between poetry and oral storytelling practices, and trying to think what's lost on the page in writing these stories down, but also sort of coming at it from the opposite direction. How can I use these stories in a way that is interesting as poetry on the page? So it's both thinking about that gap, but then also thinking about how to transform this material into a way that works as poetry.
What does that interrogatory process look like?
Um, I mean, in sort of like concrete terms, on the page, if you haven't had a chance to open the covers of this book yet, when I'm telling stories or retelling stories that I've heard from others, and I do try to tell them as exactly as I remember them as possible. Of course, my memory isn't infallible, much as I like to think that it is. That the stories, I put them on the page in italics to sort of represent the fact that I'm borrowing someone else's voice and borrowing someone else's language and borrowing someone else's experience. And then when I shift into that more sort of metacritical mode, I put it back in non-italicized text. And a lot of it kind of takes on the form of rhetorical questions, or even just sort of like like an indexical to the the problem itself and pointing to my sort of befuddlement around this problem. I don't think I ever really come up against a clear answer, but just sort of to dramatize that process of the problem, of dramatizing that process of sort of thinking through these questions and sort of showing a story that I really am invested in, and then sort of pulling back and saying, okay, well, what have I in presenting this story to you, either A, what has been lost in that process of transmission, or what are the ethical questions? Like one of the stories in the book has to deal with someone's death. And so, what are the ethical implications of passing this story now from sort of oral transmission around a shared community into a book, which is necessarily a much more, um, anonymous and, I don't know who all of the readers are, so I can't tell you who's hearing this story and what sort of ethical stance they would have towards the people involved, and or if they would transmit that story again under what circumstances. So yeah, so it's a little bit about moving back and forth between those two textures of both transmitting, retelling stories, and sometimes just little fragments and scraps of stories, but then also kind of, yeah, in a way that like your high school math teacher always said, show your work. Then I kind of show the work of sort of questioning the process of retelling these stories.
You had mentioned that in part shaping this work came about through performing it,
Mm.
reading poems. I'm curious, was that like an attempt to work out kind of taking from the oral storytelling of these stories, figuring out how they then sit on the page, and then how that then is retransmitted verbally?
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because like these are stories that I would retell. I would hear them. I'd go on the annual camping trip with my dad and his friends and hear these stories, or go home for Christmas or whatever and hear these stories. And then I'd, come back out to Guelph when I was doing my undergrad, and I'd tell these stories to friends at parties because I knew they were such wonderful stories and so full of like life and humor and everything. And so I'm very practiced in retelling those stories. But yeah, so it has become a little bit of a process of understanding how both to put the stories into the page and then how they come back out of the page again, because of course they're transformed, because very often they're kind of chopped into pieces, or I've inserted sort of asides into them. But one of the things in writing this book, and indeed in sort of writing my previous book of poetry, Harbor Grids, was that sort of question of how do you get the poem back off the page again, or off the page for the first time. And I think a lot about, I helped to organize a reading for Jordan Abel to come to New York to do a reading through the Organism for Poetic Research. And one of the things that he mentioned sort of during the talk around what he was doing, and he was performing from the book Engine, was to say that he likes writing poems that pose a problem for performance and then trying to figure out how to solve that problem. And at the time, I'd written my book Harbor Grids, which features these grids of the letter S that sort of striate the page and structure where the different phrases of the poem kind of appear on the page. And people kept asking me, oh, well, how do you read the grids? Which at first I thought, oh, that's silly. Of course I wouldn't read the grids. But the more people kept asking me about it as the book was sort of imminently coming out, I realized that I had a problem. And like, I could take Jordan's lead and try to solve that problem. And so I took a field recording of the park where those poems were written. And when I read from that book, I use that field recording to say this audio stands in for the grids, which In the most negative reading of the grids, they sort of speak to the kind of hyper-rational logics of capitalism, in the way in which the New York City grid is laid out, streets are laid out as a grid, but also they speak to a sort of like phenomenological enmeshment in the world, that there is no there is no consciousness without the world that consciousness is enmeshed in. And so by using that field recording, it plays the part of like that reminder that there is no poet without the neighborhood in which the poet resides or whatever. And so coming out of that book and thinking more about it was the first time that I'd really thought deeply in that way about how the poem comes back off the page again. And also to I did my doctorate at NYU, and my dissertation chair and mentor there, Oroyo and Noel, emerged out of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe scene, but also is sort of intimately bound up with kind of post-language poetics and that sort of scholarly poetic scene. And so he moves between those worlds in such a fascinating way, and he does very performative readings of poetry, but ones that have a very kind of ironizing, critical edge to them. And so it was in watching him read frequently, as I did while I was there, that I started myself also to think about the stakes of performance more seriously. And then, of course, too, moving into writing this book, which is about oral storytelling, I was sort of, that was probably, I wouldn't have been able to write this book without those two prior sort of uh, sources of knowledge, I guess, and learning about the world. And so it was then that I was able to sort of ask these questions about performance is partially what, that presence of the performer's body, that social context is part of what's lost when I try to just write these stories as poems on the page without any sort of acknowledgement of that difference.
On that topic about the how do you read the, in that case, the grids, there are a few pages where it's not blank, but it has an asterisk. Like, I'm curious about how you interpret reading that.
Yeah, there's one or two instances where I've got square brackets and then with the hash marks kind of filling space. Is that what you're referring to?
There's those, yeah. I mean, I guess I took those, and obviously, like, there's a couple where you swear in the book, but there's some where I thought like maybe it's meant to like M dash a swear, but there was a couple like where it's not necessarily a blank page, but there's like one kind of like asterisk looking kind of note.
Yes. I know what you mean. And it's funny because Norm, who's the publisher at Invisible, had really sort of grilled me about these asterisks and what they were doing, and whether they represented, because a lot of people sort of on first looking at those asterisks assume that it's sort of like breaking the poem into kind of part one, part two, part three, because of course it is one book length long poem. And for me, a big part of the asterisks there, they do a little bit sort of segment it into kind of different movements in that way, although I don't like to think about the book as having sort of distinct sections as much. Does sort of there are definitely sort of thematic shifts that happen where those asterisks fall, but it's also so it's a little bit sort of taking a mental breath as we sort of transition out of kind of one phase of the argument of the book into another phase, whether that's sort of setting aside kind of, the first section is a little bit more about like how I came to see myself as a poet or whatever, and then the next section or whatever you want to call it kind of thinks more about performance, and then we shift into another one about kind of the strange politics of my family and the town where I grew up through the pandemic. So there is a little bit of thematic separation marked by those asterisks, somewhat unintentionally, but certainly it's there. But also too, when I was writing this book sort of as a book, and indeed when I sort of think about books generally, I try to write both thinking about the page as a compositional unit. So everything that appears on the same page as everything else is meant to be on the same page as everything that it appears with. There's not the break between the one page and the next page I don't take for granted. But then also too, sort of embedded within that process is necessarily understanding that, and this is a little bit of I think it's a misquote from the Mexican artist and poet Ulises Carrion, which is in his foundational sort of essay on book art, the idea that a book is a sequence of spaces. And so, like, that sequencing of spaces is also both, it's a temporal sort of dynamic, and it's also sort of a bodily dynamic, right? So, when I'm putting the kind of final manuscript of the book together, I always try to read it on my screen so that I've got the verso and recto both on the screen at the same time, so I can sort of see what the relationship between the two sides of the page would look like together in any given sort of spread of the book. And so sometimes those asterisks or pages that are just blank for blank's sake, a lot of the times that's just because whatever page comes next, I really, really wanted it to be either a recto or a verso. So it's a little bit about getting that correct alignment. But it is also about there's sort of these kind of pauses between different phases of the sort of overall structure of the book.
Gotcha. I know as a reader, I'm kind of trained to think like an asterisk that there like should be like some sort of footnote or like, end note that I'm supposed to refer to when I read something like that. But it did give me pause, which I guess ultimately is what it's trying to do.
And it's funny because this was another thing with Norm. He was confused about how the page numbering should act on those asterisk pages, like whether if it was truly like a break between sections, that then traditionally there wouldn't be page numbers there. But if it wasn't a break between sections, then does he put a page number at the bottom of the asterisked page? And the final decision that was, sort of what if we didn't have any page numbers at all? And then that sort of helps to sort of get the reader in the mind that it is one just like long flow, and it's not sort of meant to be sectioned out in a way.
This is maybe a hard pivot, but I do want to talk about the relationship between the land and the economy and the jobs that happen in the place where you come from, and the extractiveness of these stories, as you put it, and whether you're comparing the two as like it's all resources and how we use them, that like in some ways when Kate says you're still conceiving yourself as a blue collar worker, that like you're viewing poems as extractive in the same way that the logging that happens is extractive, and I'm wondering about kind of like, is that something you're wrestling with, is like what kind of work is quote unquote extractive work?
Yeah, for sure. And this too, like it comes like the mention of the land, this, and I'm looking, my screen beside me here is a photograph of the kind of backcountry valley where I like to go fishing and camping in it. And so, one of my most favorite places in the world. But I think about the way in which both like the jobs of the people in my father's generation, back before the economy was centered around tourism in the valley, and when it was centered around extractive resources, mining and logging and so on and so forth. But then also too the way in which it sort of struck me as I was assembling all of these stories and seeing them sort of all together on the page all at once. You start to notice that they're all stories, excuse me, that are essentially about going out into the woods and killing an animal, or going out into the woods for the purpose of chopping down the trees or extracting the gypsum or whatever the case may be. And so that sort of realization that each of these stories, as they unfold, kind of mirrors the logic of settler colonialism on a microcosmic scale. And so then, as a person who is invested in sort of critiquing the logics of settler colonialism and critiquing the extractive logic of capitalism, but also as a person who deeply loves these people who have earned their living through sort of frontline resource extraction, or alternately who tell these stories that reenact this microcosmic logic of settler colonialism. And as someone who loves these stories, the kind of question is, well, what am I to do with that? What do I do with the fact that I love these stories, but I also am troubled by the politics of them?
And ultimately, you kind of write that these stories become a responsibility. That it's who gets to tell it, who gets to hear it, and then where do you fit once you've heard it?
Yeah, and and indeed too, just sort of I want to think too about I guess there's a tension in all of this between forms of community that are extractive and forms of community that are mutual. Whether that community is between people, whether that community is between people and the land, but ways of sort of being and moving through the world that take seriously that these are all reciprocal relationships, and two, thinking about poetry also as a type of relationship. And there's a way that we could write poems that are extractive, and there's a way that we could write poems that is reciprocal, and wanting to kind of think about in sort of stealing or borrowing or retelling these stories, is this a relationship that's one of reciprocity, or is this a relationship that's one of theft and extraction? And I'm not sure I still quite totally know where this book sits on that continuum, though I'm relieved that the family members and friends of the family who are mentioned in this book have all taken quite warmly to it.
Is that hesitation or something that you're still wrestling with? Is that why you write? I don't want to have to write another poem.
It's funny that, I mean, partially, like what if I didn't have to write any more poems? What if we could just tell stories? What if we were just, I mean, and it's nostalgic and utopian, and those two words are extremely dangerous positions to put yourself in, but what if there was a way of making art that was just telling stories around the campfire, and each person took their turn and each person sort of riffed off each other? What if that was what poetry was doing? But also too, that comes back to one of the other epigraphs from this book, which is this moment in Charles Olson's infamous 1965 lecture at Berkeley, in which he's in the middle of telling this very, very long story, which doesn't really have a point. It's about him getting drunk with another poet and another poet's wife or something like that. And you can tell the audience is groaning and just waiting for him to read the next poem. And I think it was a bit of a confrontational lecture, and I think some of the audience might have been yelling at him to just read the next poem. And he says something along the lines of, I don't care if I never read another poem, I want to finish this story. And I just like thought that, perfectly captured some of the energy that I wanted to bring to this project, that it's about storytelling, and I don't know, the kind of magic that uh, happens there. But then too, yeah, like that critique of what is it that we do when we're doing poetry? Why does poetry writing often feel so like, I don't know, pained in a way?
Plus, you have another epigraph with Robert Duncan commenting about Charles Olson. That, like, even everything is in conversation with each other for you.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Is that
yeah, and just think. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry? Yeah, no. I was just. I mean, maybe I should give you the space to think about that then. But I was just thinking about kind of like that this is all rooted in not hiving things off from each other. That like
Mm,
other people's stories, that you have a responsibility when you listen to them, but when you then share them or transmit them, but also that like poetry, maybe and academia both have a instance of hiving themselves off from other things, and this is kind of pushing them back towards the community.
And I think too, just to sort of take seriously, as to take a Charles Olson poem as seriously as, my dad's best friend Jerry telling a story around the campfire, that these are both, aesthetically advanced, linguistically deep, like thoroughly, embedded in a tradition, um, modes of engaging with the language as a sort of malleable aesthetic substance, and sort of taking them both seriously, and taking them both on their own terms, as much as taking them both seriously. That the oral story is not a poem, but the poem is not an oral story, but they're both ways of using language as art.
Their country music. Zane, thanks very much for joining me on the program to discuss the book, and congratulations on its release.
Thank you so much. This was lovely.